It is not easy to find the primitive hunter as unchanged as in Labrador. Nowhere else is there the like of these Indians to be found. They depend almost entirely on caribou, and are more independent of outside resources than any other Indians of the peninsula. Here, the unwritten code of the open, the ancient beliefs, are still theirs.
William Brooks Cabot was a successful engineer living in Boston at the turn of the century. He developed a passionate interest in Labrador and the Indians who lived there, spending his summers traveling north to that remote location. He recorded his adventures in journals and photographs.
I met a Labrador missionary doctor in Boston in 1903, and he told me that he had seen Naskapi at Davis Inlet, and that if I went by mailboat to Fanny's Harbor, his friend Tom Spracklin would put me across to the Hudson's Bay post at Davis Inlet. The venture was only reconnaissance. I had no plans beyond getting my eyes on the coast. I left Boston on the Olivet. There was a change at Halifax with a day or two of waiting, and then a run of 50 hours to St. John's. The rest of the voyage, nearly 1,000 miles north, falls with the Labrador mailboat. The voyage requires a native seamanship beyond all taught navigation. Ice was visible at all times. We were, in fact, in Arctic water, the eddy and edge of the polar stream. Here, it may be said, the North begins. The Labrador landscape is Arctic, and was to me an utterly new northern world. On the hills were scattered boulders, lichened on sheltered faces, though at a distance the hills appeared to be of an absolutely lifeless grey rock.
Cabot stepped ashore at Fanny's Harbor in search of Tom Spracklin. He was 1,000 miles from home, alone, and dependent on the hospitality of strangers.
I scrambled up on Tom Spracklin's stage. Tom stared a little, but agreed to take me in. The Spracklins had a few hundred quintals of fish taken in the last few days. 4 hours' sleep the crew were getting then. Poor Spracklin, his arms and wrists set with fish spoils, slept with his bandaged arms raised clear of all touch. In his face, the look of the overworn. Yet all were cheerful. The fish were on.
With Spracklin's help, Cabot got across to Davis Inlet. The trip took a few hours, with favorable winds and seas. Remnants of the past remain. The Hudson's Bay Company set up its post here in 1869 to buy the fish and furs of the local settlers living in the bays. Only later did they make an effort to attract the Indian trade. The Naskapi had never had much interest in trapping, the caribou providing for most of their needs. For the agents assigned this post, it was home. Though life was lonely, they coped as best they could. It was here that Cabot would make his first contact with the Naskapi.
In the morning, someone announced Indians before we were up. They had come from Chinutavish on the George River, bringing what fur they had to trade. I learned that the Indians generally came out to the north, where they left their canoes, taking a Hudson's Bay Company sailboat the rest of the way to the post.
The impression the Naskapi make on one is apt to be a little mixed. Their thin legs and their horsetail hair are decidedly not of our world. Their travel clothing is nondescript and dingy, though in new white-skin clothing they are wholly picturesque. As untamed aborigines, Stone Age people, they lay hold of one. The look in their eyes is the look of primitive man in the open.
The Hudson's Bay Company vessel was anchored in the run. The Indians were busy between ship and shore, putting through the heavy job of transporting freight, such as flour and pork and molasses. In the intervals, the workers spread about the place in a vacation spirit. One evening, one of the younger ones got out the trader's football, and there was a good deal of fun.
Once the goods were ashore, the company agent and his people shut themselves in the store to open the cases and get ready for trading, leaving the Indians outside.
The camera they're shy about, but I went about the place taking what snaps I could. The profile of one of their leaders, Ustanitsu, is not bad. He did not know I was taking it. The old man had quite a presence, and would, I think, get a hearing from any assembly the world over in which he should arise to speak. Before trading, Ustanitsu asked me if I wanted to make a picture, and grouped a lot of his people on the platform while I took 3 snaps. As I turned away, there was a bedlam of cries for tobacco. Later, I bought 26 of the little black plugs they prefer, 1 for each man, and with pockets and hands full, went out to distribute them. I was quickly surrounded by wild riot.
My dealings with them are rather difficult on the whole. I know a little of their language, but I do not attempt anything ambitious. Ustanitsu asked me, "Why don't you go inland with us and have a tent and a wife at Chinutavish?" I told him I should like to, but it was getting late in the season.
Now came the trading. The old men coached the younger ones. There was on this occasion no ill temper, and much laughing as the goods were chosen. Prices were stiff. A light single shotgun muzzleloader was $16.
About midday, trading ended. Then a curious change came over the Indians. They had been easy, good-natured, leisurely. Now they were hurried, unresponsive, silent. 2 boats were made ready for the return trip north. Without taking leave or looking back, they scattered down the wharf and into the boat. They were unmodified wild men again, and disagreeable to boot.
Cabot had wanted to go with them, to get inland a short distance at least, but no one would help him. The Hudson's Bay Company officials didn't trust him. They thought he might be intending to trade with the Indians. Cabot realized that he had achieved all that was reasonably possible for a first trip. He was already making plans for his return. He had learned that the Indians traveled inland from a bay north of Davis Inlet, cutting across the country into the valley of the Assiniboine River. They traveled toward the interior plateau. He would follow this route and hope to find his way to their hunting territory on the Barrens at Mistinipi. On this and subsequent trips, Cabot would travel with friends.
We started for the highlands with a few days' supply of bacon, hard bread, tea, and tin rations, the light round tent, and a blanket apiece, a gun, a few cartridges, a camera and films, pretty much completed the loads. We followed the northern shore of the lake. There are bays on that side, leading towards passages in the hills. In one of these was the standing poles of a winter lodge, used for cross-country travel in the direction of Davis Inlet. A few miles further on, I saw a caribou stag on the shore. It took 3 well-placed 30-30s to get him off his feet. To the west, past the lake, the country breaks back a little with a slight valley. The Mistoston River comes in from the south.
It was like coming to a crossroads. Cabot looked for signs of the Indian route, but could find nothing. Whether the route continued west or turned south, he could only guess. Uncertain as to what to do, he lingered near the river fork, hoping for some indicator. As luck would have it, he would soon learn the way.
2 or 3 miles above the lake, a canoe with 3 Indians shot around the bend. I knew them all from my previous visit to Davis Inlet: Napio, Pacuna, and Ustinitsu. Before making a fire, they cautiously placed a circle of wet sand on the moss, for the weather was dry, and only white men burn their own country. It was a friendly meal, and they stood the camera well enough, although Ustinitsu winced a little. We talked for a while, and Ustinitsu drew a map on the sand, showing the high portage and some of the country beyond. Once out of the river valley and up the high portage, there is no more stream work. All is lake and portage. Off they went, having only a deer spear in the boat, making fast time.
Following their directions, Cabot continued further up the river into a long, narrow canyon that cut deep into the Labrador Plateau.
The north side of the river valley is almost a wall, sloping or sheer from end to end. The portage matched the Indians' description well. The place looked impassably steep and high, but the finding of Indian tracks settled all questions of it being the right place. We camped for the night, so as to be rested for the difficult work the next day. It's a steady, pathless climb of over 1,000 feet. One really needs hands as well as feet a good deal of the way. We took up only 1 load a day. The canoe we got off rather easily with, passing it from one to the other. The last pull to the top was nearly too much. I half gave up, crawled around the slope until I found water, and then revived, finished out.
Having climbed out of the river valley, Cabot and his companion found themselves on the open barrens, an immense rolling, windswept plain stretching as far as the eye can see, broken only by countless ponds and lakes. Only lichens and moss cling to the hills. Willow bushes and shrubs grow in the marshlands. Trees are rare. A lone spruce, a few feet tall, might have been growing for 100 years. To the inexperienced, the landscape is without distinguishing features, and it is easy to get lost.
We had occasionally seen some sign of the Indian route. It is not a trail. Here a stone laid upon a boulder on the crest of a ridge. There, a burnt branch at the end of a pond. There is no visible path. We went on, heavy loaded, making triple portages between the ponds.
In the afternoon, a wolverine came loping across the way at 80 yards. Walcott made a handsome shot just under the chin. An autopsy proved it full of mice. The high barrens are the worst place for mosquitoes. Going with a little breeze in mosquito weather is something fierce. They hang in the eddy in front of one's face and strike the face like thick dry snow.
The wind blew again the next day, and we put in the time afoot, exploring for the route. As to finding our way, we were little better off at night than at morning.
The next day, Ustinitsu and his two companions found us. We talked about the route and finally arranged with them to help us as far as Mistinipi.
We passed through 7 or 8 ponds that day, camping late on a small lake where there were few trees. On the south for some miles were wonderful smooth moraines and pairs of caribou paths following along the slopes and in places slanting to the water. This is subarctic perfection, the heart of the northeastern range of the caribou.
The caribou travel thousands of miles across the peninsula following ancient instincts. Ancestral trails mark their routes, rutted paths bearing the imprint of 1,000 hooves leading down to the water where the great herds cross. The Narrows at the head of Mistinipi is such a place. There the Naskapi camped, awaiting the arrival of the herds. Hundreds of the animals would be killed as they swam the crossing. This was something that Cabot had longed to see.
As we turned a point, there appeared 3 deerskin lodges, surprisingly conspicuous in the sunshine. The northward migration of caribou was on, and Ustinitsu and his band, numbering about 25, were spearing the deer at the east end of the Narrows. They had killed no less than 1,200 deer in a few weeks. About 300 carcasses were hauled on the gravel beach, drying hard and black in the sun and the cool September wind. The spectacle of so many carcasses was not pleasing, at any rate not to us, who had never suffered famine.
It must have been agreed that we deserved something for our walk. The older women worked at their skins, made pemmican, went through many acts of their routine. They lifted the covering skins from whatever I cast my eyes on, showed me what everything was for. The meat is smoked and dried brittle, and then reduced to powder and shreds with an iron pestle. The pounded meat is put into bladders, and melted fat is poured in. The women looked hard work and thin under all their toil upon meat and skins. The men, on the other hand, appeared well fed and easy. The man's work seemed easier. Providing game was mere sport.
A little fire was made outdoors, and a large copper kettle went on, filled with crushed marrow bones. As it boiled, Ustinitsu stirred it with a 4-foot stick, and all the camp gathered by. He skinned the grease and a little deer hair off the top, brought out a bowl, and offered it to me. It was a little tallowy, but not bad. Some of the Indians took us up to their lookout, taking along a little spyglass. But perhaps, owing to the wind, no deer came across that day.
Little is left at Mistinipi. A few lodge poles rotting in the sun, a few hearthstones where tents once stood, the remains of 1,000 caribou bones cracked open for the rich marrow they contained. The land remains, still and silent, an indifferent witness to these events. Cabot returned to Boston. It would be a few years before he could make the final push to Shinutavish.
Through the years, I had thought I should like to work out the remaining part of the Indian route to the George, from Mississippi on. Having done the knocking about the country I had, it seemed a good finish to put on the map the whole route to Shinutavish.
With this in mind, Cabot again made the long trip to Labrador, retracing the route of his previous travels, until, once again, he arrived on the shores of Mississippi. On this occasion, he had chosen to travel with a much larger party.
An interval of 4 years had passed when our party of 4 reached Mississippi, camping a few miles from the end of the lake. We had left one canoe at the high portage and a cache of food and supplies to provide for our return to the coast.
There was some question where to look for the portage route to Shinutavish. We went up a smooth hill and took observations. It looked to be 8 or 10 miles to the west. That was evidently our best way to the George River.
The lakes, called by the Indians Kanakatush, are shallow. There were many sets of standing poles.
Few people besides the Indians had ever traveled overland this far. The Indians' only contact with the outside world was on the coast. The interior was theirs, and theirs alone. It must have been disturbing to encounter white men on their land.
At the end of the last lake, we met a party of 20 Indians, most of whom I knew. They had just finished what turned out to be a long portage from Shinutavish to the lake and were heading for the coast. They rested for 2 hours or more. Ustanitsu asked about tea, and I gave him more than half of what we had and a little sugar. A noisy man at one time was evidently explaining that we had much canned goods, but gave them nothing. There were so many that it didn't occur to me to try to feed the whole lot. I told them that they could have all the tobacco that we had left at the high portage, but that we needed what provisions were there. They seemed to understand. I snapped off several rolls of film. Through our stay, Ustanitsu remained silent and with a somewhat darkening expression. Before they left, he asked me for $5. I was a bit jarred under the circumstances and gave him 2. I made a bad blunder. They know that I am wealthy, and I should have handed him $10 before he even asked. Off they went, toward the coast, and we departed soon after, following 2 men who were returning to Shinutavish. Long the object of my adventures, it was now just 6 or 7 miles away.
At the end of the lakes, the water makes its final dash to the George, the great river that flows north into the Arctic Ocean. Cabot could feel the excitement as he neared his goal, but it was a difficult journey over some of the worst ground of the entire trip. Yet his effort would be rewarded. He would meet the Naskapi in the heart of their country and complete the map of the Indians' route all the way from the coast. After several hours, he reached the shore of the George River, exhausted.
Showers came on, and we were wet and done by the time we arrived.
Several persons came down from the lodges to meet us. I tried to say we wanted to sleep there. Of course, my Indian words failed. I think I said I wanted to get married. There was a roar from the men and some scattering among the women. A little knowledge is a dangerous thing. We were shown a lodge and told we could go there. It was large, of nearly 50 poles. It would have held about 20 people, sleeping as they do like spokes of a wheel, with feet to the fire in the middle. One side of the tent was given to us visitors. We took off our wet things and hung them to dry. What went on in the course of the evening brought to us as real a phase of the primitive life as I had seen. While we were eating, the people roasted whitefish on spits. The children chewed dried deer meat. After supper, the neighbors came in. Everyone brought presents of meat and moccasins. We were given skins and blankets for the night. Someone kept a little fire, putting on wood when necessary, and we were wholly comfortable. The next day, when breakfast was done, the sun came out, and we wandered about the place. I used the camera as best I could. Everywhere, people were discussing the deer situation. The season was well on, and there was no sign of the deer coming together.
Food supplies were low. The scaffolds were nearly empty, and the outlook for the winter was not good. All the men looked hard-worked. The women, on the other hand, fuller than when I had seen them at Mr. Nippy in 1906. So it goes. Too much or too little, 1 year and another. These are people of the deer. They could escape starvation by traveling to the coast, but there would be little fur to pay for supplies, and the presence of so many would certainly be a strain on the usual supply of provisions there. Grave questions, these, and the lives of so many, depending on the judgment of a few older heads, and upon fate. I had come to know that one can never really sit in with primitive people when white companions are along. The tension of the time, with 40 Naskapi about, was plain upon most of our party. I felt it myself, and after I was pretty well around with my Kodak, one of my friends said with growing intensity, "Now we've stayed overnight, and we've seen everything, and you've got your photographs. Let's go."
There is little to indicate the Naskapi were ever here, only a few stones. Stones that once held tent skins secure against the winds, and hearthstones on which fires were built and food was cooked, now moss-covered, overgrown. These are the only monuments. Cabot and his companions now faced the long trek home, but their adventure was not quite over. Back on the Barrens, Cabot and his party discovered that their food cache had been burned. Flour, clothes, gun cartridges, all had been destroyed. And at the high portage, they found the canoe damaged, a deliberate tear made in the side. Cabot was shocked. He would never know the cause of the incident, but he took it as a message that he was not welcome. He would never again return to northern Labrador. Within a few years of Cabot's final visit, the caribou had disappeared completely. Without them, life on the Barrens was impossible. As Cabot had feared, the Naskapi were forced to seek help on the coast. There, in the summer of 1918, many of those who Cabot had met died in an epidemic of smallpox and measles. What Cabot had witnessed was gone forever. His journals and photographs remain the only record of that time and place.